Just to recap, you should have on your own looked at the somatic nervous system, which is the voluntary division of the peripheral nervous system. And if you have questions from that, please reach out to me. We're going to look at some sort of general review on that topic when we do a review for the exam, for exam 3. So definitely think about any questions you have on that, since it was looked at more independently. And then you can bring those to me any point, but also think about the review that's coming up as well. So let's begin the endocrine system here. And this is actually chapter 6 and 21, so 2 different chapters in your textbook, just because we're looking at the primary endocrine system, and then we're also looking at the glands individually and the various hormones that regulate the glands. So our first objective is to name the primary and secondary endocrine glands and the hormones associated with each. Okay, so when we think about the endocrine system, we really want to think about glands, right? There are several glands. They are dispersed throughout the body. They are divided by being primary organs, which secrete hormones, and their main role is in the endocrine system. And then we have some secondary endocrine organs as well that do have hormone secretion, but they have another primary role. An example of this is the heart. So the heart's main role is involved in the circulatory system, but the heart does release some hormones that will act on endocrine glands, and so it can be considered a secondary endocrine organ. When we think about the endocrine system, we also want to think about this hierarchy of control that is using hormones as a means of signaling. And then we also want to associate these glands with releasing their hormones into the blood. So this is what separates an endocrine gland like the thyroid gland from, say, an exocrine gland like the liver. The liver is going to release its secretion into ducts, whereas endocrine glands are going to use the blood to release their secretions, okay? So this is what divides or separates these glands from other glands in the body, like the liver, salivary glands, etc. Now, our primary endocrine glands are going to be the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. These two are going to constitute the sort of the CEO of the endocrine hierarchy. These are the most important regulatory organs that will have some level of control over the other tertiary endocrine glands. I do want to distinguish the hypothalamus from the pituitary gland in that the hypothalamus is not actually a gland, it's a part of the brain, right? It's a region of the central aspect of the brain stem, whereas the pituitary gland is going to be in direct communication with the hypothalamus, but that is going to be a separate gland. Other glands are the pineal gland, which is also in the brain, the base of the brain. The thyroid gland and parathyroid glands are together located in the tracheal region, so the neck region. Here's our thyroid gland. And within the thyroid gland, we have the parathyroids embedded. There's also the thymus gland, which is usually found anterior to the heart, or just behind the sternum region. The adrenal glands are going to be bilateral above the kidneys on both sides. And then the pancreas is in the center of the abdomen region. It's going to have dual function. So we'll talk about the pancreas later on. It has an endocrine portion, and then it also has an exocrine portion that releases the enzymes that help with the digestive process. So the pancreas kind of plays on both sides. And then the gonads are going to be obviously the reproductive glands. These will be the ovaries in females and then testes in males. So as we can see, the endocrine glands are dispersed all throughout the body. They have a whole host of different types of functions, but their main principle is that they secrete hormones, and then they are under regulatory control by the hormones that are being secreted from the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Okay, some of the secondary endocrine glands, like the heart, which secretes atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, and ANP has some effect on our sodium and water balance. The kidneys are also secondary endocrine. They secrete erythropoietin, which is the hormone that stimulates new erythrocytes, new red blood cells to be made. Although the kidneys have another primary function, they do have some endocrine function as well. The GI tract secretes several hormones: cholecystokinin, secretin, gastrin. So the GI itself can also be considered secondary endocrine. The liver secretes insulin-like growth factor. The skin and kidneys both secrete vitamin D in the active form. And then our fat cells, our adipose cells, can secrete leptin, which is a hormone as well. So as we can see, these structures and function and glands and organs, they have another primary role, and then they do have a secondary function of releasing hormones. And they too are going to be sort of dispersed all over the body. Let's look at lecture objective number 2 to describe the links between the hypothalamus and the anterior and posterior pituitary lobes. Okay, so thinking back to the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, they're going to both be located in the base of the brain. So here's the hypothalamus, right? Above it is the actual thalamus, and then right below it is the hypothalamus. And then attached to that is the pituitary gland, which is this pea-sized structure here dangling from the hypothalamus. Now, what is connecting the hypothalamus to the pituitary is called the infundibulum. It's the stalk-like structure that actually bridges that communication, and it's going to house some of the neurons that are signaling from the hypothalamus down to the posterior, the pituitary as well. Okay, now if we think about the posterior pituitary first, this part of the gland secretes neurohormones. So these are hormones that are going to be secreted from neurons instead of the actual glands, the actual epithelial cells of the gland. All right, so that is to say that the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary have two different types of function. They have two different types of tissue. The posterior pituitary is nervous tissue, right? So they're going to be neurons that are projected down into the posterior pituitary that are coming from the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary, on the other hand, is made of epithelial cells, which are going to secrete hormones from those cells instead of neurons. The two hormones that are secreted from the posterior pituitary are going to be antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH or vasopressin, and that is also going to be involved in our sodium and water balance, more so water. It's going to help with the reabsorption of water in the kidneys. And this is going to be made by the paraventricular nucleus. And it's going to balance our water and osmolarity, which is the sodium and water content of the plasma. Okay, the second hormone is oxytocin, and oxytocin is made by the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, and oxytocin is going to control milk ejection from the mammary glands. Okay, so as you can see, these neurons that have their axon terminals in the posterior pituitary, the somas and cell bodies of these neurons are going to actually be in the hypothalamus, and they're going to form different nuclei. So the nuclei are the collection of cell bodies that exist in different parts of the hypothalamus. So for example, the supraoptic nucleus is where the oxytocin is made, and then it's going to be released from the vesicles that reside in the axon terminals. So this is why when we describe hormone release from the posterior pituitary, we always say that it is released, because it's not actually made here. It's made in the nuclei of the hypothalamus, respectively, and then it is released or secreted by the axon terminals that project down into the posterior pituitary. Okay. Now we can think about trophic hormones if we shift our attention to the anterior pituitary here instead. So this is the anterior part of the pituitary gland. This does not receive the axon projections the way that the posterior pituitary does. The anterior pituitary receives instruction from the hypothalamus by way of trophic hormones. And these trophic hormones can either stimulate or inhibit the cells of the anterior pituitary to then release or not release their secretions. And the way that this is done is by the portal system, which is a connection of two capillary beds in series. All right. So when you think about a portal system, there is blood flow to one organ. So blood is coming into the hypothalamus. It's going to pick up these trophic hormones in the capillary beds that pass through the hypothalamus. And then it's going to send these hormones back to another gland, right? So usually when we leave one capillary bed, we go back to the veins and then we go back to the heart. In this example, this is a portal circulation because the blood that leaves the hypothalamus is going to go to a second capillary bed before going into the veins and going back to the heart, right? And that by definition is what we refer to as a portal system or portal circulation. Whenever blood leaves one capillary bed and goes to another capillary bed, it's going to be carrying slightly deoxygenated blood. So notice that the blood in the center here is purple because it has already undergone one exchange process of nutrients and oxygen at the hypothalamus while it is picking up the hormones that are being dropped off in the hypothalamus. And then it's going to take that blood slightly devoid of oxygen, but also containing those trophic hormones down to the anterior pituitary. And then it's going to dump those hormones off at the anterior pituitary. And these trophic hormones will regulate what the actual cells of the anterior pituitary do, whether they stimulate or inhibit their secretions. And then the hormones that leave the anterior pituitary cells will be dumped off into the capillary bed once again. They will travel by the venous blood through the entire circulatory system, right to the heart, and then eventually out to all of the peripheral tertiary endocrine glands, like the thyroid gland, the adrenal, etc. Okay. I'm going to pause here because this is sometimes a bit of a tricky concept. So I'm going to take a pause and see if there are any questions on this. Just to sort of recap what we've said so far, we've talked about the hypothalamus. This is where the neurons that release the hormones that really govern the pituitary, but also all of our tertiary, all of our peripheral endocrine glands. And so the hypothalamus is in direct communication with the posterior pituitary by way of neurons. So the posterior pituitary only receives the neurons that are projected from the hypothalamus, and then those secretions can be released from the axon terminals. Whereas the anterior pituitary is going to receive communication by way of the portal circulation. So the hormones are dropped off into one capillary bed. They travel down via these portal capillary vessels to a second capillary bed, and then these trophic hormones can have an influence on the actual epithelial cells or endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary. Okay, and then they will travel via the blood to all of the distal endocrine glands and organs that we have described. Okay, so here is a summary table, and I'm going to share this table with the recordings from today, so you don't have to scramble too much to try to write this down, but we are going to kind of describe what's happening here. So here's the hierarchy of hypothalamus, pituitary, and then the other endocrine glands. We refer to this as the hypothalamo-pituitary axis, right? Because it's the hypothalamus kind of in charge, the CEO, so to speak, and then the anterior pituitary sending out other hormones, and then the distal or peripheral endocrine glands being the third hierarchy or the third level where hormones are going to be controlling the individual secretions of these glands. Okay, so let's start with the hypothalamus. We have several trophic hormones being released from the hypothalamus. there's prolactin releasing hormone, there's prolactin inhibiting hormone, there's thyroid releasing hormone, there's cortisol releasing hormone here, growth hormone releasing hormone, and then growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And then lastly, there's gonadotropin releasing hormone. So let's look at what each of these trophic hormones will control in terms of the glands and organs that they have effect on. So prolactin releasing hormone will stimulate prolactin release, whereas prolactin inhibiting hormone will block that release. And that will block the release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary cells. So this trophic hormone will enter the capillary bed in the hypothalamus. By way of the portal circulation, it will make its way down to the anterior pituitary, and then it will either block or stimulate the anterior pituitary cells from secreting prolactin. Now, if prolactin is secreted, it will enter the systemic circulation, make its way out to the endocrine glands, and it will have a specific function on the milk production from the breast. Okay, now I want to distinguish this quickly from what we said about oxytocin. So oxytocin is a posterior pituitary hormone, and its role is in milk ejection. So that is the actual letdown or release of milk. That is to be distinguished from prolactin's hormone. Prolactin is coming from the anterior pituitary, and that is going to be involved in the production, right, the secretion or the synthesis of milk that's happening in the mammary gland. So one is milk ejection or letdown, and one is milk production or synthesis. Let's look at the thyroid hormone axis. So thyroid releasing hormone is secreted from hypothalamus, makes its way to anterior pituitary by the way of portal circulation, and then it is going to encourage the release of TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, from the anterior pituitary, and then that is going to enter the general circulation, make its way to the thyroid gland, and encourage the production of thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland itself. And that is going to be in the form of T3 and T4, which are collectively known as thyroid hormone. All right. Cortisol has a similar axis. It's going to involve ACTH from the anterior pituitary. It's going to affect the adrenal cortex. Again, another important distinction to make here. When we speak about the adrenal gland, there's the medulla, which is the central part of the gland. That is going to contain the chromaffin cells that we've talked about as far as the autonomic nervous system. But then the outer part of the adrenal gland is the cortex. And the cortex is involved in the endocrine hormone release. It's involved in ACTH influence, and then that is going to be resulting in cortisol production from the cortex. And we'll talk about all of the hormones along with cortisol that are released from the adrenal cortex. Moving to growth hormone. So growth hormone is released from the anterior pituitary under influence of either growth hormone releasing hormone or growth hormone inhibiting hormone that will encourage our various body cells from the liver, from our bones, from muscles, to secrete insulin-like growth factor. And that is a factor or a hormone that will encourage growth, that will encourage tissue growth, that will encourage various glands and cells in our body to hypertrophy and increase their metabolic output. Lastly is GnRH, so gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is going to encourage the release of FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary, and then that will have an influence on the gonads. So that's going to be the testes in males and the ovaries in females, and they will release or secrete various other reproductive hormones as a result of that. So for the testes, it's going to secrete androgens, all right? And then the ovaries is going to secrete estrogen and progesterone, okay? The testes will also secrete testosterone, all right, although that's not listed here. So androgens as well as testosterone, and then ovaries will be estrogen and progesterone.